Groundhog Day is one of my favorite movies, and that's due in no small part to it having one of the greatest plot devices in all of fiction. We all know the basic story here, right? Hotshot weatherman Phil Connors, along with his wholesome producer Rita, and much put upon cameraman Larry, is sent from big city Pittsburgh to small town Punxsutawney for the annual Groundhog Day festival, an assignment that Phil regards as beneath him, so after he half-asses his way through the job,
we got it.
He just wants to get the hell out of there, but as fate would have it, they get snowed in and have to stay another night, and when he wakes up, it's still Groundhog Day.
What the hell?
Thus introducing us to the Groundhog Day plot. An idea so simple and gimmicky that it's easy to miss just how brilliant it is, wondering why Phil woke up in the same day, if it will keep happening, and how he's supposed to stop it are great conflicts because they're interesting problems that are difficult to solve, and that's only half the brilliance. The other half is that Phil doesn't just relive the same day once, he relives it hundreds, maybe even thousands of times, and every time he does, both he and us are confronted with these same questions, and instead of becoming repetitive and redundant, this constant renewal of the plot only intensifies our interest. Every near miss just makes us hungrier to see how the conflict will be resolved.
Come on!
While it's impossible to separate the story of Groundhog Day from the wonderful plot device at its center, the plot device alone is so ingenious that it could theoretically work in almost any kind of story, and since you can't copyright a plot device, it was only a matter of time before other writers came along and used the idea for themselves.
On your feet, maggots!
30 years later, there's now several infinite time loop films, and in this video I thought it'd be interesting to compare some of them to see if we can determine just who did the Groundhog Day plot best. In no particular order, I'm gonna start with...
Where's my unit? And under whose jurisdiction is the simulation?
Source Code, a science fiction thriller with a premise so complicated it was honestly a struggle for me to even write it down. But here goes. A man wakes up on a train not knowing where he is or how he got there. Next to him, a woman he doesn't recognize keeps calling him Sean. After telling her his name is Coulter, he heads for the bathroom and gets the shock of his life when he doesn't recognize his own reflection, and then the train explodes. When he wakes up again, he still doesn't know where he is or recognize the woman who's talking to him, but at least this woman knows who he is, Army pilot Coulter Stevens. Without answering any of his immediate questions, like how the hell he wound up here, she informs him that he's been selected for a very special mission. A train was bombed recently in Chicago, and they don't know who did it, so the team here at Source Code, led by the brilliant yet probably mad scientist Dr. Rutledge, somehow implanted Coulter's consciousness into the brain of a now deceased passenger who somehow still holds the memories of everything that happened up to the point of the explosion. And Coulter is supposed to use those memories to find out what happened and who's responsible. That's the premise.
Wait, what?
If you think it sounds completely bonkers, then you and I think alike. But it totally works. And why not? The Groundhog Day plot is already ridiculous, so adding further ridiculousness on top of it is like adding maple syrup to pancakes, and despite sounding complicated, the movie is actually easy to follow. Even with all its sci-fi futurism, it feels more like an old-fashioned whodunit. Coulter has to put on his detective cap and find a killer, which he isn't very good at, so he makes a lot of mistakes, which is also to the film's credit. The Groundhog Day plot is built for characters who constantly stumble because they always get to try again. That's what I love about these movies. They're essentially stories about learning. Not only does Coulter have to learn who the killer is, he also has to learn how he wound up in Source Code, an intriguing story by itself helped considerably by Captain Colleen Goodwin, who's caught between viewing Coulter purely as a tool, like her ruthless boss, and seeing him as a fellow soldier who's been through a lot and deserves to be treated with honesty and respect. This puts her in a tough moral dilemma. Is it okay to treat one person inhumanely if it's done in the name of helping the greater good? If having a great plot and subplot wasn't enough, there's even time for a romantic side story with Christina, who is completely unaware that her co-worker's body is now occupied by a complete stranger. Somehow, this also works. Though the people on the train don't technically exist anymore, it's impossible for Coulter or us to think of them that way. If anything, the fake world of the train is even more real to Coulter and us than the actual real world of source code. And again, despite constantly switching back and forth between them, you never feel lost. At least not in a bad way. While source code dips a tiny bit in the middle, it's still an outstanding film. So overall, I give it an A-, and as for its incorporation of the Groundhog Day plot, I gotta give that an A because the creativity is off the charts.
Sisters don't keep secrets.
I'm totally having deja vu right now.
I have it all the time. It's supposed to mean like someone's thinking about you while they're masturbating.
Happy Death Day is a slasher comedy that even a complete wuss like myself didn't find overwhelmingly scary or excessively funny, and yet I gotta admit I still kinda liked it. It tells the story of the stupidly named Tree Gelbman, a superficial mean girl college student who belongs to the snootiest sorority on campus.
You sneaky little biatch.
On this seemingly typical day in Tree's life, she wakes up in a stranger's bed, hears from secondhand sources of her drunken behavior the night before,
Rammed your tongue down Nick Sim's throat right in front of Danielle.
continues an affair she's having with one of her professors, and is awful to pretty much anyone she happens to come across before heading out to another party that night. En route, she takes the creepiest detour imaginable, runs into someone wearing a mask of a giant baby, which is her school's mascot for some reason, and gets murked. But she doesn't die. Instead, she wakes up with the day reset. If that was a little easier to explain than the premise to source code, it's mainly because Happy Death Day doesn't bother explaining why it's happening. At least not at first. Still, these films have more in common than you might think a slasher comedy would with a sci-fi thriller. In addition to using the same plot device, they're also both whodunits. Like Coulter, Tree has to find a killer before they strike, although in her case, it's her own murder that she's trying to solve, which you got to admit is an awesome idea for a story. Also, like Coulter, Tree is not a very good detective, which again is to the film's credit because the Groundhog Day plot is built for novices who mess up a lot, then get to learn from their mistakes. One cool twist that Happy Death Day puts on this learning process is that unlike Coulter or Phil, who can die indefinitely with no real consequences, Tree's body somehow accumulates damage from all the horrific murders she endures, which means she can't keep this up for much longer, which successfully adds tension to the story. I also like how the film is kind of meta, by which I mean the characters understand the rules of the world they're in and then use those rules to their advantage.
See you soon, asshole.
However, while Tree is smarter than a typical horror movie dunce, she still misses a lot, like when she managed to survive this violent encounter with her killer, then celebrated after like she accomplished something. No, you didn't, Tree. If you survive till tomorrow, you still won't know who the killer is, and you'll be out of the time loop. And that's not even the biggest thing she misses. Put yourself in Tree's shoes. You know a violent psycho is gonna come for you every night until you stop them. So, what should you do? Should you create a list of suspects and go through them one by one, like she does? Or should you go to a place you know the killer is going to return to and just wait for them? She could booby trap this place, or bring a weapon and try to defend herself, or failing that, she could just let the killer kill her, but be sure to rip their mask off in the process. While the concept of Happy Death Day is great, the actual movie is clunky. Still, like I said, it's fun to watch, so overall I give it a B, and as for its incorporation of the Groundhog Day plot, I definitely give that an A.
Now listen carefully. This is a very important rule. This is the only rule. You get injured on the field, you better make sure you die.
Similar to Source Code, Edge of Tomorrow is a science fiction thriller, except with way more action and way less science. Thanks to a massive budget behooving big star Tom Cruise that director Doug Liman put to good use, it is by far the most visually exciting film on this list. It tells the story of Major William Cage, a media specialist ordered against his wishes to the front lines of a worldwide battle against aliens. When he tries to run away, he's delivered by force into the hands of a ragtag group of soldiers who make sure he's on time for the battle tomorrow, where he lasts about 5 seconds before getting unlifed. But wouldn't you know it, instead of staying dead, he wakes up with the day reset. Now, if you haven't seen this, and you had to guess what reason, if any, the movie gives for Cage getting stuck in a time loop, what do you think it is? If you somehow guessed that he's doused in the blood of a rare blue alien that has the ability to reset the day so it can avoid dying, then you are one clairvoyant bastard, because yeah, that's the premise. And it works so long as you don't overthink it, which for me is simply not an option. This war should not be close. Aliens capable of interstellar travel would have technology that humans could only dream of, yet these aliens, upon arriving, turn into, like, violent octopuses. What exactly is their plan here? Hide below the ground and scare us to death? Oh, and did I mention they have the ability to control time? Seriously, how is this fight competitive? I don't know. We aren't given a whole lot of information about these aliens, which from a narrative standpoint was probably a smart move because, again, you don't want to overthink it. The way I see it, this movie isn't really about aliens anyway. It's about a flawed man stuck in an insane situation that forces him to change, which is essentially what all these movies are about. Coulter has unresolved issues with his father, Tree treats everyone, including herself, like shit, Phil is a selfish, nihilistic, underachieving asshole, and so is Cage, although in his case, he's also a coward.
Oh my God!
I'm sure I would be as well in this situation, but over the course of the film, Cage evolves, and a lot of that is thanks to a character that all these films feature in one form or another. Every Groundhog Day protagonist needs someone they can talk to about their unique situation. Coulter has Colleen, Tree has Carter, Phil has Rita, and Cage has also Rita, which is a nice little homage. Rita Vertasky, the Angel of Verdun, serves as Cage's role model, mentor, motivator, and love interest all at once. She's really the main reason Cage changes. If he never met her, it's unlikely he'd put this ability he never wanted to good use. Instead, he'd probably just keep being the same person he already is. It's Rita who convinces him that together they can win the war. And remember, the real war here isn't between Cage and the aliens, it's between Cage and himself. Can he rise up and become a better person, like Rita? On his own, probably not, but with her practically dragging him along, he can. So while Edge of Tomorrow might look like a tough guy alien action shoot 'em up, it's really the heartwarming story of someone helping someone else become a better person. Aww. And it's pretty good. Overall, I give it a B+, and though the alien blood thing is kinda stupid, even in the middle of a war zone, the Groundhog Day plot still kills. Pun intended.
I am the Antichrist. I'm just kidding, there is no God.
Last on my list is the romantic comedy Palm Springs, which is probably the least known film here because it's exclusive to Hulu, but if you get a chance to check it out, I highly recommend it. It's different from the rest of the Groundhog Day films where one character is stuck in a time loop and the person they fall for is outside it, which makes the time loop an obstacle to them being together. In Palm Springs, both main characters are stuck in the loop, which means the loop is actually what makes their relationship possible. Without it, it's easy to imagine that Niles and Sarah, two lazy, philandering, borderline alcoholics, would meet at the wedding of Sarah's sister, have a one-night fling, and then go their separate ways. But after Sarah follows Niles into this mysterious cave and winds up stuck in the same loop he's already in,
What the fuck did you do to me?
they start hanging out and develop feelings for each other that are deeper than what originally led to what likely would have just been a one-night stand. Eventually, they act on those deeper feelings and enter that early relationship period where everything is new and wonderful and no one can stand to be around you because you're so annoyingly happy. These two are so happy, they don't even seem to care they're stuck in a time loop anymore. It just goes to show that with the right person, almost any circumstance can be enjoyed. Of course, the good times don't last forever because, like all our main characters, these two have serious flaws they need to work on. What's interesting about Niles is that when we first meet him, it seems like he's already evolved to a level of maturity that's kind of admirable. Yes, he still spends his days drinking, screwing, and lazing around, but at least he no longer despairs over being stuck in a time loop. Instead, he accepts that he has no control over that, which seems very stoic at first. Yet the real story with Niles is actually much darker. You know Brooks from Shawshank Redemption, someone who's been on the inside for so long he's forgotten how to function on the outside? Niles isn't too far off from that. So you could say the time loop here is a metaphor for getting stuck in a rut. What do you do when that happens? Do you embrace the rut like Niles and use it as an excuse for never having to change or evolve? Or, like Sarah, do you refuse to give up and insist on continuing to grow, even if doing so risks leaving behind someone you care about? Palm Springs is a gem of a movie. It's deep if you're willing to dig, and even if you aren't, it's still hilarious. Overall, I give it an A, and though the reason for the time loop is kinda lazy, its use in the story is still impeccable. Alright, if you've been keeping score, then I guess my rankings would look something like this. So does that mean Palm Springs is the best of the Groundhog Day movies?
I'm sorry? What was that again?
Come on, you knew how this was gonna end.
I'm a god.
You're God.
I'm a god. I'm not the god. I don't think.
Of course the best Groundhog Day movie is Groundhog Day. Why? Well, consider how in most of the other movies, the time loop isn't character specific. Like in Source Code, anyone who gets programmed into this will enter the train loop. Just like anyone who gets alien blood in them will reset the day, as will anyone who enters this cave. That's one thing I like about Happy Death Day. It comes with the additional question of why Tree. Over the course of the story, we get a pretty satisfactory answer to that. First, we learn it's her birthday, then we learn she shares her birthday with her mother, and finally we learn she's dealing with a huge amount of grief over her mother, which helps explain a lot of her self-destructive behavior. You could even argue it's her mother who keeps bringing her back to life. I like that answer because you have to do a little bit of work to arrive at it, and with Groundhog Day, you have to do a lot more. Unlike with Tree, this particular day means nothing to Phil. He views anyone dumb enough to celebrate it with contempt, which of course raises the question, why, of all people, would he get stuck here? You could argue the answer is purely narrative. This is just his Ebenezer Scrooge moment where a higher power is going to show him the error of his ways. But I like to think Phil's own subconscious is somehow responsible. Though he becomes extremely depressed later in the film, I would argue he's already depressed in the very beginning, possibly from loneliness. I once heard depression described as your brain forcing you to focus on a particular problem, and until you do, it won't let you move on, which is essentially what happens to Phil. He's forced to take a hard look at his own life, which he's particularly ill-suited for. Phil is not the self-reflective type. He sees the fault in others, not in himself. Consider his initial response to getting stuck in a time loop. He gives in to every reckless hedonistic impulse he has, while remaining oblivious to how he might escape from what he considers his own private hell. That mindset alone could explain why he's trapped here. Phil thinks being stuck in Punxsutawney prevents him from getting what he wants, when in reality, everything he wants is right in front of him. He just has to recognize it, which again, he's terrible at. Now, in fairness to Phil, unlike the characters he inspired, he doesn't have anyone to guide him, not even Rita, who's a good listener and a good role model, but who has no direct advice to offer, because the solution here isn't as obvious as you might think. Like if I asked you point blank, what exactly does Phil have to do to escape from this day, would you know the answer? It's not simply that he needs to be a better person. If that's all it took, then why is he still here after he repeatedly tries to save this poor homeless guy? This isn't something Phil would have done in the beginning, so clearly he's evolved, and the fact that he fails is devastating for him. So why doesn't this compassionate act set him free? I think the reason is that it would teach him the wrong lesson. The person Phil needs to save is himself. Consider his actions when he falls for Rita, which happens pretty early in the story. After learning the sort of qualities she looks for in a partner, he then tries to trick her into thinking he already possesses them. When Rita makes it abundantly clear that she isn't the type of lady to bang some dude she just met, Phil kinda goes off the deep end. He figures if he can't sleep with Rita or figure out how to escape from Punxsutawney, then life just isn't worth it. It takes him a long time to arrive at the right path, which again has to do with learning, but in a specific way. While it's true that Phil learns throughout the story, it's not till the final act that he goes about learning for the right reasons. At first, he learned mostly passively, through repeated exposure that he didn't have much of a choice in, like when he learned everything about everyone in this diner.
They're supposed to be getting married this afternoon, but Debbie is having second thoughts.
What?
On the few occasions that Phil actively tried to learn, it was usually for nefarious ends, like when he robbed this armored truck, or when he was trying to get Rita into bed.
You speak French.
But after her rejection and his failure to end it all, Phil sets about simply trying to be better. He takes piano lessons, he starts exercising kindness towards those he previously got annoyed with, and he does so with no real end goal in mind. There's a scene where he catches a kid who falls out of a tree, and afterwards he's like,
You have never thanked me!
but that's what real kindness is, when you act without expectation. And ironically, it's by not expecting anything in return that Phil finally gets gets what he wants. When he stops trying to seduce Rita by being someone he isn't and just focuses on being his best self, she falls in love with him. Something similar happens when he stops trying to escape from Groundhog Day and simply accepts that he's here. But unlike Niles, who used that acceptance as an excuse to never be more than what he currently is, Phil decides that if this is the only day he'll ever get to live in, he'll make the most of it. He'll live it the best way he can while being the best version of himself he can. And that is why I regard Groundhog Day as the best of the Groundhog Day films and the best example of the Groundhog Day plot.
What would you do if you were stuck in one place and every day was exactly the same and nothing that you did mattered?
Now that sums it up for me.